On July 26, 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act into law. This single piece of legislation created the institutional architecture of permanent empire. It created two institutions that had no precedent in American history: the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council. The CIA was ostensibly created to coordinate intelligence gathering. The reality was more expansive: covert operations for secret activities to influence foreign governments, support friendly factions, and undermine enemies. This authority was added through classified directives and expansive interpretation, not explicit legislation. The agency operated with minimal oversight. Officers were immune from normal legal constraints when operating abroad. The United States had never maintained a permanent peacetime intelligence agency. The founders had been deeply suspicious of standing armies. They would have been horrified by a permanent secret service accountable to no one. George Kennan, who helped design the containment strategy, later expressed regret about what the CIA became. The greatest mistake I ever made was not recognizing early enough that the agency we created would become Frankenstein's monster.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
August 15th, 1945. VJ Day. Americans poured into the streets to celebrate. In Times Square, a sailor kissed a nurse. A photograph became an icon. Church bells rang. Factory whistles blew. The most destructive war in human history was over. 16 million Americans had served. Over 400,000 had died. Now, the boys were coming home. Americans knew what came next. They had seen it after every previous war. The armies would demobilize. The factories would convert back to civilian production. The emergency powers would expire. And life would return to normal. After the Civil War, the Union Army shrank from over 1 million soldiers to 27,000 within 2 years. After World War I, the American Expeditionary Force came home almost entirely. This was the American pattern: mobilize for war, then return to the Republic. After World War II, something unprecedented happened. The war ended. The war footing did not. The bases remained. The military budget stayed high. The emergency agencies became permanent agencies. New institutions were created, not just for the war that was concluded, but for a permanent state of vigilance that would never end. The Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, NATO, the nuclear arsenal, and the global network of military bases. None of these existed before World War II. All of them exist today, 8 decades later. They have outlasted the Soviet threat that justified their creation. They have survived every attempt at reform or reduction. They have become the permanent architecture of American power. The old right had warned that intervention would transform America. They predicted that emergency powers would become permanent. They foresaw the constitutional limits would be abandoned. And they warned that the distinction between war and peace would dissolve. Every one of their predictions came true. This episode examines how the national security state was constructed, the decisions made, the institutions created, the republic transformed. Not by amendment or revolution, but by accumulation. One agency, one doctrine, one alliance, one precedent. Until the country that emerged bore little resemblance to the country that entered the war. The United States won World War II. The question is, what it lost? I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 8 of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements, from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, the national security state, World War II's permanent legacy. This episode corresponds to Article 8 of our series that's published on Substack on Sundays. Today, we examine the institutional transformation that followed World War II, the creation of permanent agencies, permanent alliances, and a permanent war footing that replaced the founders' constitutional design. We will trace the Truman Doctrine, the National Security Act of 1947, NATO, the Korean War Precedent, and NSC-68, the documents and decisions that built the architecture of American empire. As always, this podcast expands on themes from the article, provides additional primary sources, and addresses the human decisions that the written format cannot fully explore. Let us begin. Before we can understand what was built after the war, we must understand how the war was fought. Because the methods of total war created the conditions for permanent mobilization. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, President Franklin Roosevelt announced that the Allies would accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. No negotiated peace, no compromise, no armistice. Total victory or nothing. Winston Churchill privately opposed the policy. He understood that unconditional surrender removed any incentive for moderate elements in enemy countries to seek a negotiated end. If surrender meant national destruction rather than merely military defeat, why would anyone surrender early? Stalin welcomed the doctrine. It ensured the Western powers would fight to exhaustion, while the Soviet Union positioned itself to dominate post-war Europe. The unconditional surrender doctrine prolonged the war on both fronts. In Germany, it strengthened Hitler's hand against internal opposition. The July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt, the famous Valkyrie plot, failed partly because potential supporters knew that even a successful coup would not produce acceptable peace terms. Germany would face unconditional surrender regardless. The war continued until Berlin fell and Hitler was dead in a bunker. In Japan, the doctrine complicated peace. By mid-1945, Japan was clearly defeated, its navy destroyed, its cities burning, its empire collapsing. Elements within the Japanese government sought to negotiate, but unconditional surrender potentially meant removing the emperor, and the Japanese military would fight to the death to prevent that. The atomic bombs were partly a consequence of this logic. How else could unconditional surrender be extracted from an enemy prepared to die rather than submit? Victory in World War II required moral compromises that should not be forgotten. Alliance with Stalin meant alliance with the greatest mass murderer in history to that point. The Soviet regime had killed millions through deliberate famine, political purges, and the Gulag. American wartime propaganda rehabilitated Uncle Joe for public consumption, but the reality was that America fought alongside one totalitarian horror to defeat another. Strategic bombing of civilian populations became official Allied policy. The distinction between military and civilian targets, a cornerstone of just war theory for centuries, was deliberately abandoned. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 killed an estimated 25,000 civilians in a city of questionable military value. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, more than the immediate deaths at Hiroshima. General Curtis LeMay, who directed the firebombing campaign against Japan, later acknowledged what this meant. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. The moral distinction between Allies and Axis, clear enough when comparing political systems, blurred considerably when comparing methods of warfare. Then came the atomic age. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. Approximately 80,000 immediate deaths from a single weapon. Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945. Approximately 40,000 more. The radiation effects would kill tens of thousands more in the months and years that followed. The decision remains controversial. Defenders argue the bomb saved the lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan, estimated hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese. Critics argue Japan was already seeking peace. That demonstration might have sufficed. That the real purpose was to intimidate the Soviet Union. What is beyond dispute is that the atomic bomb changed everything. Warfare, strategy, diplomacy, the very meaning of national security. All were transformed by weapons capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. The permanent national security state that followed was constructed partly as a response to this new reality. If American cities could be annihilated without warning, permanent vigilance seemed necessary. If enemies might possess such weapons, could America ever afford to let its guard down? The war was won, but the conditions for permanent war had been created. Franklin Roosevelt died April 12, 1945, less than 3 months into his fourth term. Vice President Harry Truman, who had barely been briefed on major war decisions, suddenly found himself president. Truman learned of the atomic bomb project only after taking office. He had not participated in the wartime conferences, and he inherited a war half-shaped by decisions he had not made, nor had even been informed of. His advisors, Secretary of State James Burns, General George Marshall, Undersecretary Dean Acheson, diplomat George Kennan, became the architects of the Cold War. They shared certain assumptions that the Soviet Union posed an existential threat, that American power must be projected globally, that the pre-war pattern of limited engagement was obsolete. Truman's personal style reinforced these tendencies. He prized decisiveness over deliberation. The buck stops here meant making decisions and moving forward, not reconsidering. In this regard, one of his first great tests came in February 1947. Britain informed the United States that it could no longer maintain its commitments in Greece and Turkey. Britain, exhausted by war, facing economic crises, was withdrawing from its traditional role as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. This was the passing of the Imperial torch. For over a century, Britain had maintained the balance of power that kept the sea lanes open and prevented any single power from dominating Europe. Now Britain was stepping back, and the question was whether America would step forward. Greece was fighting a civil war between the royalist government and communist insurgents. Turkey faced Soviet pressure for territorial concessions. If America did not act, both countries might fall into the Soviet orbit, or so the argument went. On March 12, 1947, President Truman addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech would commit America to a role Washington and Jefferson would not have recognized. Listen to the key passage. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. And further, the free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of our own nation. The specific request, $400 million to aid Greece and Turkey, was modest. The commitment was unlimited. Notice what the Truman Doctrine did not contain: geographical boundaries, temporal limits, or clear definitions. It applied wherever free people face subjugation. But who defined which peoples were free? It would continue as long as threats existed, but there always exist threats. The language was deliberately open-ended. Dean Acheson later acknowledged that the administration had framed the issue in ideological rather than strategic terms in order to mobilize congressional support. The specific situation became the occasion for a general commitment. Senator Robert Taft saw what was happening. He voted for Greek-Turkish aid, but warned against the doctrine's expansive language. I do not want war with Russia. If we assume a special position in Greece and Turkey, we can hardly object to the Russians continuing their domination in Poland, Romania, and elsewhere. Taft's warning proved prophetic. The Truman Doctrine's logic would justify Korea, Vietnam, and interventions on every continent for the next half century. Once America committed to opposing communism everywhere, there was no limiting principle. 4 months later, on July 26, 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act into law. This single piece of legislation created the institutional architecture of permanent empire. The act unified the military services under a new Department of Defense. It created the United States Air Force as an independent service It established the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the permanent coordinating body for military planning. But most significantly, it created two institutions that had no precedent in American history: the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council. The CIA was ostensibly created to coordinate intelligence gathering, functions previously scattered among military services and the wartime Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. The reality was more expansive. The CIA was given authority for covert operations, for secret activities to influence foreign governments, support friendly factions, and undermine enemies. This authority was added through classified directives and expansive interpretation, not explicit legislation. The agency operated with minimal oversight. Congressional committees were informed selectively, if they were informed at all. The budget was hidden. Officers were immune from normal legal constraints when operating abroad. This was something genuinely new. The United States had never maintained a permanent peacetime intelligence agency. The founders had been deeply suspicious of standing armies. They would have been horrified by a permanent secret service accountable to no one. George Kennan, who helped design the containment strategy, later expressed regret about what the CIA became. The greatest mistake I ever made was not recognizing early enough that the agency we created would become a Frankenstein's monster. The National Security Council was created to coordinate foreign policy, defense policy, and intelligence at the highest level. In theory, it was advisory. In practice, it became the locus of real decision-making on war and peace. The NSC operated in secret. Its deliberations were classified. Its decisions were implemented before Congress knew they had been made. The constitutional structure presumed that decisions about war and peace would be debated publicly by representatives accountable to voters. The national security state presumed that such decisions required secrecy, speed, and executive discretion. These two presumptions are incompatible. One had to give way. The Constitution gave way. On April 4th, 1949, the United States joined 11 other nations in signing the North Atlantic Treaty, creating NATO. Article 5 of the treaty declared that an armed attack against one member would be considered an attack against all. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. This was precisely what Washington's farewell address had warned against: a permanent entangling alliance, an automatic commitment to go to war if any of a dozen other nations were attacked. American blood pledged to defend foreign territory without fresh deliberation. The Senate debated the treaty, and Robert Taft, consistent to the end, opposed. The Atlantic Pact is a precursor to war. It is an alliance which obligates us to go to war if certain events occur. It obligates us to consider an attack on one member as an attack on all. It is a military alliance, and we are required to maintain an armed force sufficient to carry out those obligations. Taft warned that NATO would require permanent American military presence in Europe, enormous defense spending in the subordination of American foreign policy to alliance obligations. He was outvoted 82-13. Every one of Taft's predictions proved accurate. American forces remained in Europe permanently. Bases established in 1949 remain operational today, over 75 years later. The temporary alliance against Soviet threats survived the Soviet collapse. NATO not only continued after 1991, but expanded, adding Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic in 1999, the Baltic states and others in 2004, and continuing to expand toward Russia's borders in subsequent years. The alliance designed to contain Soviet power became, after the Soviet collapse, an instrument for extending American influence ever eastward, with consequences we will examine when we reach the Ukraine crisis later in the series. But then came Korea, and the precedent that would damage constitutional government more than any military outcome. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea. President Truman decided to intervene immediately. But notice what Truman did not do. He did not ask Congress to declare war. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress, and Congress alone, the power to declare war. This was not accidental. The founders had deliberately made war difficult to enter. They wanted deliberation, debate, and explicit consent of the people's representatives before American blood was shed. Truman called the intervention a police action, conducted under United Nations authority. When asked directly about a declaration of war, he responded, "We are not at war." 37,000 American deaths later, we were apparently still not at war. Truman's argument that a UN Security Council resolution could substitute for congressional declaration was constitutionally untenable. The Constitution does not empower the president to commit forces to combat because an international body requests it. Treaties cannot transfer congressional powers to international organizations. But the precedent was established. Truman fought a major war without congressional declaration and succeeded politically. And every subsequent president has claimed similar authority. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Even President Trump's foray into Venezuela was a police action, an action of law enforcement. Not one has been fought under a declaration of war. The congressional war power, central to the constitutional design, became outmoded. The Korean War established another pattern: limited war without victory. General Douglas MacArthur wanted to expand the conflict, bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, potentially use nuclear weapons. He publicly criticized the administration policy, challenging civilian control. Truman fired him in April 1951. MacArthur came home to a hero's welcome, addressed Congress to thunderous applause, but his dismissal stood. Civilian control of the military, one constitutional principle that survived the transformation, was preserved. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty. The peninsula remained divided. American forces remained. The war technically continues today, suspended not concluded. This became the model. Limited objectives, no victory, no declaration, no end.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning. Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from General Welfare to The New Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
In April 1950, before the Korean War began, the National Security Council produced a document that would serve as the blueprint for permanent American militarization. NSC 68, authored primarily by Paul Knights. The document framed the Cold War in apocalyptic terms. The Soviet Union posed an existential threat to civilization itself. Half measures were inadequate. Only massive military buildup could preserve the free world. NSC 68 called for tripling the defense budget. It advocated military buildup. And listen carefully to this phrase: whether or not there is a formal declaration of war. The document proposed that the United States maintain sufficient force to fight simultaneously in Europe and Asia while deterring nuclear attack. Permanently, indefinitely, regardless of constitutional niceties. The logic was totalizing. Listen to this sentence. A defeat of free institutions anywhere is a defeat everywhere. Consider what that sentence commits America to. If any country, anywhere, falls to communism, or whatever the threat of the moment, American security is diminished. There can be no peripheral interest, no areas outside the American perimeter, no limits to the commitment. If a defeat of free institutions anywhere is a defeat everywhere, then America must be prepared to fight everywhere, forever. NSC 68 also embraced unlimited methods. The integrity of our system will not be jeopardized by any measures, covert or overt, violent or nonviolent, which serve the purpose of frustrating the Kremlin design. Any measures, covert or overt, violent or nonviolent. The language provided ideological justification for assassination, coups, propaganda, subversion, whatever was necessary. The end justified the means. Here's what also makes NSC 68 remarkable. It remained classified until 1975. The American public, whose taxes funded the buildup, whose sons fought the wars, was not permitted to read the document that justified these policies. For 25 years, the blueprint for the American grand strategy was secret. The Korean War provided the occasion to implement NSC 68's recommendations. The defense budget did triple. The permanent military establishment that Garrett, Flynn, and Taft had warned against became reality. The document's framework, existential threat, global commitment, unlimited means, shaped American policy for the next 4 decades. Now we come to the irony. The man who built the machine, warning against what he had built. January 17th, 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivers his farewell address. Eisenhower was no dove. He was the general that had won the war in Europe. He had authorized CIA coups in Iran and Guatemala. He had expanded the nuclear arsenal from roughly 1,000 warheads to over 22,000. He had built the very thing he warned against. Listen to his words. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower described was not a conspiracy. It was an incentive structure. Defense spending never returned to pre-war levels. Defense industries became permanent constituencies. Companies that manufactured weapons depended on government contracts. Their workers depended on these jobs. Their communities depended on those workers. And every congressional district had defense contractors. Every state had military bases. The incentive structure was perverse. Peace threatened livelihoods. War, or at least the permanent preparation for war, ensured prosperity. Reducing military spending meant unemployment, closed factories, abandoning bases. Increasing, it meant jobs, contracts, campaign contributions. And nobody in those locations, when facing the loss of jobs or their community well-being, they do not stop to think about what could be happening with that production capacity instead. It's one thing to lose the tax revenue to apply it to the military buildup. It's another thing to consider the opportunity cost. How that production could have helped society instead. What other jobs would have been created? What other products? What other services? What other value? Of course, the military-industrial complex was not what the founders envisioned. They kept the military deliberately small, relying on citizen militias rather than the standing armies, precisely because permanent military establishments create constituencies for permanent war. The military-industrial complex was the institutional expression of what Madison warned against: war's tendency to become self-perpetuating. Eisenhower saw it eventually, and he warned against it. But it was a farewell address, not a governing philosophy. He warned against what he himself had enabled. And that warning changed nothing. What was lost in this transformation? Congressional war power, abandoned without constitutional amendment. Presidents now take the nation to war on their own authority. The last formal declaration of war was in 1942. Civilian control over intelligence, never properly established. The CIA operated for decades with minimal oversight. When abuses were revealed in the 1970s, assassination plots, domestic spying, drug experiments on unwitting citizens. Reforms were enacted and then gradually eroded. Constitutional limits on executive action replaced by the doctrine of national security. This phrase, appearing nowhere in the Constitution, became justification for secrecy, surveillance, detention without trial, and actions that would be criminal if performed by private citizens. The founders' foreign policy, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, replaced by permanent intervention, global military presence, and alliance obligations that commit America to fight for dozens of other nations. The distinction between war and peace abolished. The Cold War was neither formally war nor genuinely peace. The war on terror continues indefinitely against an enemy that cannot surrender. The permanent emergency has become the permanent condition. Was this transformation necessary? The Soviet Union was a genuine threat. Weapons of mass destruction changed the calculus. Perhaps the old ways were obsolete. But the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The national security state did not. NATO expanded rather than dissolved. The CIA continued rather than reformed. Military spending declined briefly, then after September 11th, restored it to Cold War levels. The institutions created for a specific threat found new threats to justify their continuation. The permanent emergency required permanent emergency. The old right asked whether America could remain a republic while becoming an empire. The national security state provides that answer. It could not. The institutions of empire are incompatible with republican government. Permanent military establishments, permanent intelligence agencies, permanent executive war-making. These are the apparatus of empire, not of republics. Whether that transformation was worth it, whether it can be reversed, whether the republic the founders designed can ever be recovered. These are the questions for the citizens to answer, if citizens are still permitted to decide. As we end today, consider a few questions. Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex after spending 8 years building it. What does this suggest about the difficulty of restraining institutions once established? Truman fought a major war without congressional declaration. Do you believe that was constitutional? Do you believe it today? What precedent did it set for every single war since, and how do we still not discuss this when looking at current conflicts? NATO was formed to counter the Soviet threat. The Soviet Union has been gone for over 30 years. Should NATO have dissolved? Should it have transformed into a trade organization? Should it have included Russia when Russia asked to join after the Soviet collapse? What interests justify its continuation? Whose interests? And finally, NSC 68 declared that a defeat of free institutions anywhere is a defeat everywhere. Is that true? If so, what are the limits of American responsibility? And what defines free institutions? If not, why did this logic guide American policy for decades? There's a lot to think about there, a lot to consider. And it's not easy. It's not tough. It's not easy. It's tough. And it impacts how we act going forward. Speaking of going forward, next Sunday, Article 9 begins Part 4 of the series, the CIA and Covert Empire. And in this specific chapter, we examine Kermit's game, Iran 1953, and the template for regime change. The institutions built in 1947 would be put to use overthrowing a democratically elected government, with consequences that shaped the Middle East for generations and continue to haunt American policy today. And on Tuesday, our contemporary application episode will examine the national security state's persistence, how institutions created for the Cold War adapted to the war on terror, and what the patterns suggest about institutional permanence. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been Episode 8 of Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements, from the Founders to the Forever Wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube page at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes, and follow me on X at Jay Kellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.